The provision way station at Threscale 12 was not a place people came to unless they had run out of other options. I had worked it for 6 years. Before that, Threscale 7, and before that, a pair of outer margin depots whose names I have mostly forgot, 11 months at one, 14 at the other, long enough to learn the intake procedures and short enough that none of the faces stayed with me. By the time I landed at 12, I had been doing this work for 19 years, and I no longer flinched at what walked through the intake corridor. That is not a boast. It is simply true. You see enough resettlement cases, enough transit tier registrants carrying everything they own in a single sealed container, enough families where the adults are eating half rations so the children can have full ones, and eventually the flinching stops. What replaces it is something harder to name, a kind of steady attention maybe. You stop being surprised, but you don't stop seeing. The corridor at Threscale 12 was 12 meters long, low-ceilinged, lit by overhead panels that had never been properly calibrated to the way station's outer margin light cycle. They ran slightly warm, amber-yellow instead of the standard blue-white, which made everyone who came through look a little more tired than they already were, and most of them were already very tired. There were 4 intake stations along the left wall. I ran Station 1 myself on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were the heavy days, when the resettlement transports docked and unloaded, and the corridor filled up to standing capacity for about 3 hours before it thinned out again. The other 3 stations were staffed by my team. Pell, who had been with me for 4 years and handled the reclassification forms with a precision I envied. Merritt, 2 years in, still learning which forms triggered which reviews. And Cale, who was 6 months out of his posting training and had a tendency to apologize to registrants when the allocation system denied them, which was a habit I was slowly working him out of. The morning the 2 sisters came through, it was a Thursday. I noticed them in the intake queue before they reached my station. The younger one first. She was perhaps 16, slight in the way that wasn't natural, the kind of slight that comes from a sustained caloric deficit over several months rather than from build or genetics. She was carrying a sealed personal container not much larger than a transit standard bag, and she was holding it with both hands in front of her, which told me it was heavy relative to her current strength. Her skin was the same amber pale shade as her sister's, Velsorn house coloring, the kind you see often enough in the outer margin resettlement population that I had learned to recognize it. And her eyes were copper gold, very large, and slightly unfocused in the way that hunger does to a person's attention. She was not unwell in a medical emergency sense, but she was close enough to it that I noted her without writing anything down yet. The older one was watching me notice. That was the first thing I registered about her specifically. She was watching me watch her sister, and she was doing it without any appearance of watching me at all. It is a difficult thing to describe. She appeared to be looking at the intake station signage above my desk, but her attention was entirely on me, tracking what I saw and how I responded to it, and I had been doing this work long enough that I could feel it, the quality of being assessed by someone who was very carefully not appearing to assess you. She was perhaps 28. Close-cropped dark hair, copper gold eyes like her sister's but steadier, the kind of steady that is maintained rather than natural. Her posture was correct. Whatever her registration said, she had spent time in environments where posture was noted. They reached my station at 9:42. I asked for their registration tokens. She produced them from a small case she wore at her left side, both tokens, hers and her sister's, already ordered and ready. Transit tier, both of them. Resettlement code Threscale sector incoming, logged 12 days prior at Velkareth station transit processing. The younger one, Sale, the token said, Sale Arath, 16 years, unaccompanied minor traveling under the older sister's guardian designation, had a medical notation flag on her file, a brief one, the kind that gets added at transit processing when the intake officer is busy and the situation is not immediately critical. Caloric intake below standard threshold monitor. Monitor is the word transit processing uses when they want to have noted something without committing to doing anything about it. The older one's name on the token was listed as Kethi Arath. No house designation, no lineage notation, just the name and the registration tier. I looked at the younger one's allocation under the transit tier. It was a standard transit tier provision package, enough for an adult at maintenance caloric level, which was already low for a 16-year-old in any condition, and significantly insufficient for a 16-year-old with a documented deficiency flag. The system had not automatically adjusted it because the flag was a monitor notation, not a medical intervention notation, and the tier algorithm did not trigger on monitors. This was a known gap in the system. I had filed 2 formal observations about it in the last 3 years. Both had been acknowledged and neither had been addressed. I looked at the older sister. She was looking at the allocation figure on my screen. She had read it upside down from across the desk without appearing to lean in, which meant she was literate in the standard provision notation format, which was not common in transit tier registrants. Another data point I noted without writing down. I said, "There's a gap in your sister's allocation. The transit tier doesn't auto-adjust for a monitor flag. I can file a reclassification request, but it'll need a medical notation from the way station's health station to trigger the review." She said, "How long does the review take?" 7 to 10 days if it goes through standard processing. I can flag it for expedited review, which gets it to 3 to 5. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone processing information. She had already processed it before I finished the sentence. The quiet of someone deciding something, and deciding it in a direction I was about to find out. "What else can be done?" she said. It was not phrased as a question. I told her that outside the formal review, the only other option was a supervisor discretionary top-up, which was limited in quantity and reserved for documented emergency cases, and that her sister's file as it currently stood didn't meet the emergency threshold, though I could pull in the health station for an assessment today if she wanted to walk that path. She nodded once, then she said, "Can I speak with you outside the intake queue?" Pell glanced at me from Station 2. I told the sisters to wait near the end of the corridor, by the bench under the east loading door, and I finished the 2 registrants behind them in about 8 minutes and then walked down to the bench. The younger one's Sale was sitting on the bench with her container in her lap. She had her eyes closed and her head tipped back slightly against the wall, not asleep, just resting. The older one was standing. She waited until I was close enough that I could hear her at a low volume, and then she said, without any preamble, "I am offering myself to you, in exchange for a full provision reclassification for my sister." She said it the way you say a thing you have rehearsed, not because it was easy to say, but because rehearsing it was the only way to get it said at all. The flatness was deliberate. The calm was maintained. Her eyes were absolutely steady, and her hands at her sides were absolutely still, and both of those things told me more about what it had cost her to say it than anything else would have. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said no. She blinked once, just once, a small, involuntary break in the maintained composure. She had prepared for negotiation. She had prepared for refusal with conditions. She had prepared, possibly, for a different kind of acceptance than she was offering. She had not prepared for a flat no delivered without any accompanying emotion. I said, "I'm going to file the reclassification now. I'm going to walk your sister to the health station myself to get the medical notation done today, because it won't take more than 20 minutes and it'll cut the review time to 48 hours instead of 3 to 5 days. In the meantime, I'm going to issue a supervisor discretionary top-up for today and tomorrow under emergency pending status, which I have the authority to do when a formal review is already in process. Your sister will eat today. The reclassification will clear in 2 days, and after that she'll be on the correct tier." Keitha Arith looked at me. It is a specific experience, being looked at by someone who was prepared for one kind of transaction and has been handed an entirely different one. There is a recalibration that happens, you can see it if you are paying attention. The frameworks they came in with, the calculations they had made, the cost they had already paid in their own head, all of it has to be set down and looked at again from the outside. It takes a moment. It is not a comfortable moment for either person. She said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," I said, "but your sister has a monitor flag and a transit tier allocation that doesn't cover her actual need, and fixing that is what this way station is here for. Come on." I walked back up the corridor to the intake desk, pulled the reclassification form up on my screen and began filling it. Keitha followed me. She stood on the registrant side of the desk, and for the first time since I had looked up and seen her in the intake queue, she did not look like someone holding herself in a particular configuration. She looked like someone who had been holding herself in a particular configuration for a very long time and had, for a moment, forgotten to. Sale had come up behind her sister. She was watching me type. I said, without looking up from the form, "Do you want to come around and see what I'm putting in? Sometimes it helps to know what the form actually says." There was a pause. Keitha said quietly, "Yes, thank you." They both came around. I walked them through it. The transitory settlement tier reclassification trigger, the monitor flag elevation to a medical notation flag which would require the health station stamp, the emergency pending top-up I was issuing under supervisor authority which would cover today and tomorrow, and the 48-hour expected review window once the health station notation was in. Sale read the screen carefully, her eyes moving left to right with more focus than I would have expected from someone who looked as tired as she did. She pointed at one line and asked what the distinction was between a reclassification review and a reclassification appeal, which was not a question I had been asked by a 16-year-old in recent memory. I explained the difference. She nodded. She said, "So the review is automatic once the medical notation is in, but the appeal would require us to file a separate request." "That's right. And the review is the correct path here." "It is." She nodded again, satisfied, and looked at her sister. Something passed between them, the kind of look that belongs to two people who have been making decisions together for long enough that full sentences are unnecessary. Keitha put her hand briefly on her sister's shoulder, just for a moment, and then took it away. I printed the emergency pending documentation and stamped it with my supervisor seal. Then I came around the desk and said I'd walk them to the health station if they were ready, because the health station officer, a compact-trained medic named Joreth who had been at the way station for 2 years, sometimes ran long on his morning rounds, and it was better to catch him before noon. We walked the way station's main corridor. Provision wing to the health station was about 4 minutes at an easy pace, past the storage bays and the equipment lockers, and the small common area that had a table and a wall screen that no one had turned on in about 3 weeks. Sale walked between us. She was quiet, but she was alert in a way she had not been in the intake corridor, her attention moving across the way station's interior with a precise, cataloging quality that was recognizable once you knew to look for it. She was noting the layout, the exit points, the storage bay configurations. At 16, with a caloric deficiency flag and a single personal container, she was assessing the environment she had arrived in with the automatic thoroughness of someone who had been in uncertain environments before, and had learned that noting the layout was not paranoia but sense. I said to her, "The provision staging bay is the big room at the end of that corridor, past the second storage bay. After Joreth signs off on the notation, I'll take you through there directly. You won't have to go back to the intake queue." She looked at me, the copper-gold eyes very steady. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without performance, which is the only way it means anything. Joreth was in his station, between morning rounds and the midday appointment block, which was the window I had been hoping for. I explained the situation briefly: monitor flag elevation, reclassification review initiated, medical notation needed today to trigger the 48-hour review cycle. Joreth did the assessment in about 12 minutes. He was thorough, and he was unsentimental about it in the professional way. He noted Sail's current weight, her caloric history from the transit processing flag, ran the standard outer margin deficiency panel, and signed off on the notation without commentary. He gave Sail a printed summary of what he'd found and what the notation said, and told her to come back in a week for a follow-up. She read the summary in the corridor outside his station, while Keithai was thanking him. I watched her read it and thought about the morning she had been carrying before she walked into my intake corridor. However that morning had looked, this was a different one. That matters. It is a small and specific thing, but it matters. We went to the provision staging bay. It is not a beautiful room, concrete composite floor, deep shelving along 3 walls, the kind of overhead lighting that is functional and nothing else, the faint ambient smell of sealed ration packaging, and the ventilation system that moves air through the storage areas. But the shelves were full, which on outer margin way stations is not always the case, and which I took a quiet, private satisfaction in when it was. Threscale 12 ran full about 70% of the time. The other 30% we managed with what we had, and the order of priority for those periods was a thing I had worked out with my team in the first year and had not had to revisit since. I pulled the emergency pending top-up from the dispensary terminal, a resettlement tier 2-day package, which was what I was authorized to issue under emergency pending status, and I set it on the staging counter. Sail looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at a thing when you have been thinking about that thing for long enough that seeing it in front of you requires a moment of adjustment between the idea and the reality. Her hands, still holding the printed summary from Joreth, were very still. Keithai was standing slightly behind her. She was looking at the package and then at me, and her expression was something I did not have an easy name for, not relief exactly, because relief implies the anxiety has resolved, and I did not think Keithai Areth's anxiety resolved quickly or easily. It was something closer to the moment just before relief, when you understand intellectually that the thing you feared is not going to happen but your body has not been informed yet. I said, "There's a side table by the east loading door. You're welcome to eat here." Sail looked at her sister. Keithai looked at me. Then she said we wouldn't be in the way. "No," I said, "the morning rush is done. It's quiet until the afternoon transport." The side table was a functional thing, metal frame, 4 chairs, a fixed overhead panel that ran a little cooler than the staging bay's main lights, which made it feel slightly more like a room and slightly less like a warehouse corner. I had eaten at that table probably 1,000 times in 6 years. Pell and I ate there on Tuesdays when the morning queue cleared, and sometimes Cale joined us when he was not still processing the last of the intake forms. It was not a comfortable table in any design sense, but it was the only table in the staging bay, and that made it the table. I set the package down and left them to it. I had work to get back to. The afternoon transport was at 1300, which gave me about 2.5 hours to clear the morning's intake backlog, check the reclassification queue, and walk through the storage inventory that I had been putting off since Tuesday. I went back to the intake desk and did those things. Pell had handled the rest of the morning queue without incident. The reclassification form I had filed was already in the system and had pulled the 48-hour expedited flag correctly. The storage inventory took about 40 minutes and revealed a minor discrepancy in one of the secondary shelving units that turned out to be a data entry error from the previous week's delivery, which I corrected and noted. At 11:15, I made tea in the small preparation area behind the intake desk. I made 2 cups because that is what I do when I am working, and then I thought about the side table and I made 2 more. I carried all 4 cups on a tray to the staging bay. Sail was asleep. She had folded her arms on the table and her head was resting on them, turned to one side, and she was breathing with the slow depth of someone who has finally relaxed the part of themselves that was on watch. The provision package was mostly gone. Keithai was sitting upright across from her, watching her sister sleep, and when I came in she looked up at me with the quick attention of someone who had been on guard and had chosen, consciously, to let me be an exception to that guardedness. I set the tray down without saying anything. She looked at the cups, then she looked at me. Tea. Standard compact blend, I said. It's what we have. She wrapped both hands around a cup and held it without drinking for a moment, looking down at it. I sat across from her, 2 chairs to the left of her sister's sleeping form, and picked up my own cup. We sat in silence for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. The staging bay was quiet, the ventilation running its low background hum, the amber-tinted light from the overhead panel doing its usual thing. Sail breathed. The tea cooled slightly. Keith, I said eventually, you understood what I was offering. Yes, I said. And you said no, because it was against your regulations. I thought about this, partly, I said. But mostly because I wasn't going to accept it. She looked at me. Those are the same thing. They're not, I said. One of them means I would have accepted it if the regulations allowed. The other means I wouldn't have regardless. The copper-gold eyes, very still, reading me the way she had read the intake form, the way she had read the allocation figure upside down from across the desk, looking for the gap between what I said and what I meant. I said your sister needed food. The system had a gap in how it processes her situation. Closing the gap is the job. It's got nothing to do with anything you were offering. She was quiet. You've been managing her alone for a while, I said. It was not a question. She looked back down at her tea. Since Velkarath Station. 7 months. And before that. Our parents were part of the House delegation that was present during the Kethsorn processing closure. She said it with the same flat precision she had used in the intake corridor, the practiced evenness of someone who has explained a difficult thing enough times that the explanation has worn smooth. They were detained for the review period. They have not been released. I did not say anything to that, because there was nothing useful to say. The Kethsorn processing closure had been a significant administrative event in the outer margin resettlement network, and its effects on the families caught inside it had been well outside the scope of anything I could address at Threscale 12. What I could address was in front of me. Your registration is transit tier, I said, both of you. After sales reclassification clears, she'll be on resettlement standard. What about you? She shook her head slightly. I've been managing. I looked at her. I'll check your file. It's fine. I'll check it anyway. She looked up from her tea. There was something in her expression that was not quite irritation and not quite amusement, and landed somewhere between the two, which was the first time I had seen anything on her face that wasn't maintained composure or the careful break in it. It was a better look on her, more like a person and less like someone holding a defensive position. She said, you do this for everyone. When I can see it needs doing, I said. She considered that. And when you can't see it, then someone has to show me. That's what the intake process is for. She looked back at her sister. Sail had shifted slightly in her sleep, turning her head to the other side, and the printed summary from Jorath had slipped from her fingers and was lying on the table in front of her. Keithai reached across and straightened it without waking her. She's going to want to ask you questions, Keithai said, about the reclassification process. She was already working out the review versus appeal distinction when we were at your intake desk. I noticed, I said. She's been doing that since she was 8, working out the structure of whatever system she's inside. A pause. It kept us moving at Velkarath. She mapped the transit processing system in about 3 days, and found two pathways that got us onto an earlier transport than our ticket allowed. Legitimately. The near amusement again. Completely. She found two provisions in the transit code that the processing staff weren't applying, filed the forms herself, and we were on a transport 4 days ahead of schedule. I drank my tea. She's going to find the provision code gaps here too, then. Probably. Good, I said. I've been filing observations about the monitor flag to allocation gap for 3 years. If she wants to work through the formal submission process, I'll show her which department it goes to. Keith-I looked at me. I am not a man who particularly requires being looked at in any specific way. I have been in this work long enough that what I do mostly registers as procedural to the people I do it for. A supervisor who files the correct form, issues the correct documentation, walks the registrant to the health station when the intake queue allows. That is what the way station is. That is what I am here for. I had not, in 6 years at Threscale 12, spent much time thinking about whether the way I understood the job was the way anyone else understood it. But Keith-I Arath was looking at me the way you look at something when you were expecting one thing and found another, and are still working out what category the new thing belongs in. She said, "You filed the form before I could explain why the offer was the only option I could see." Yes. You didn't need me to explain it. No. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I've had to explain it twice, at the last 2 way stations." I did not ask what had happened at the last 2 way stations. I did not need to. The monitor flag on sales file had been added at transit processing at Velcarath, which meant 7 months had passed between the flag being added and the flag being acted on in any meaningful way, and the two of them were still on transit tier allocation, and Keith-I had walked into my intake corridor with the specific prepared calm of someone who had made a decision, and rehearsed it to the point where rehearsal was the only thing standing between the decision and the terror underneath it. What I said was, "It's done now." She looked at her cup. Her hands around it were relaxed now, the first time since she had walked through my intake corridor that I had seen her hands relaxed. "Yes," she said, "it is." We drank tea. After a while I went back to the intake desk to prep for the afternoon transport, and when the transport docked at 1300, I had my team in position, and the afternoon queue moved through without incident. I checked the reclassification queue at 1430 and confirmed that sales file had flagged correctly in the system with Jorath's notation attached. 48 hours, maybe less, depending on the review officer's load. At 1520, I went back to the staging bay to check the afternoon's inventory. Sale was awake. She and Keith-I were sitting at the side table, and Sale had the printed summary from Jorath spread out in front of her alongside what appeared to be a handwritten notation she was making on the back of the emergency pending documentation. She looked up when I came in. "What's the formal submission address for the monitor flag gap observation?" she said. "The department specifically." "Compact Outer Margin Provision Standards Review, Sector Division Threscale," I said. "Your submission needs a case reference number, which I can pull from your file once the reclassification clears. It'll give the observation a linked case to point to." She wrote that down. "What are the 2 previous observations you filed? Do you have the reference numbers?" I looked at her. "You want a link to prior observations in a new submission. If there's a documented pattern, the review is weighted differently than a single case." I had not known that. I made a note to ask Pell, who was more systematic about these things than I was. "I'll find them," I said. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her notation. Keith-I was watching me with the expression I was beginning to recognize, the one that sat between amusement and assessment, the one that was the most unguarded version of her face I had seen. She said, quietly, so as not to interrupt her sister's work, "She'll have a draft submission ready before the reclassification clears." "I don't doubt it," I said. I checked the inventory. noted 2 items that needed restocking in the secondary bay, sent the restock request through the system, and went back to the intake desk. At 16:40, the afternoon intake window closed. I ran the end-of-day reconciliation, filed the supervisor log, and signed off on the day's documentation. At 1700, I went to tell the sisters that the staging bay would be closing its open access hours at 17:30, and that they were welcome to come back tomorrow at the morning intake window. They were still at the table. Sale had finished her notation and was folding it carefully, and Keithai was holding an empty cup, and both of them looked, for the first time since I had seen them in the intake queue, like people who had been somewhere that had not required them to make any calculations for a few hours. "Tomorrow at intake," I said, "I can walk you through the resettlement housing assignment process. Your transit tier registration will need to be updated once the reclassification clears, and the housing assignment follows a different queue than the provision allocation." Keithai said, "You don't have to manage that for us." "I know," I said. "Come at 9, the queue's lighter on Fridays." She looked at me. Then she looked at the empty cup in her hands, and then at her sister, who was watching me with the copper-gold eyes, and the careful attention that I was beginning to understand was simply how Sale Arath looked at everything. Keithai said 9. 9, I said. They left at 17:25. I closed the staging bay, finished the end-of-day procedure, and sat at the side table for a few minutes before I left, the way I sometimes do when the way station is empty and quiet, and the overhead panel is running its slightly cool light, and the ventilation hum is the only sound. There was a Velthorn seed case on the table. Small, dark-shelled, the kind that the Velsorn resettlement population sometimes carry as a habit object, something from the houses they came from, the gardens they used to have. I did not know if Sale had left it deliberately or if it had slipped from her container when she was moving her things. I set it next to the emergency pending documentation, which still had her notation on the back of it, and I left both of them there for morning. The reclassification cleared in 31 hours. I was at the intake desk when the system notification came through, which was faster than 48 hours but not surprising. The health station notation had been clean and Joreth had flagged it with a priority marker I had not specifically asked for but was grateful for. I pulled up Sale's file and confirmed that the allocation tier had updated correctly and that the new provision schedule would begin at the next standard distribution window, which was Friday morning, the next day. I sent Keithai a notification through the way station's registrant messaging system. It was a standard notification template, the same one I sent for all reclassification completions, but I added one line at the bottom, both of you at 9. The housing queue opens at 9:15. She replied in about 3 minutes. The reply said, "We'll be there." Sale has a question about the prior observation reference numbers. I found myself smiling at my desk, which was not a common occurrence, and which Pell noticed and did not comment on, which is one of the reasons Pell has worked with me for 4 years. They came at 9. Sale had the draft submission. It was thorough, more thorough than my own 2 prior observations, and structured in a way that reflected actual knowledge of the compact standards review process that she should not have had at 16 and apparently did anyway. She had referenced both of my prior observation numbers, which I had sent her through the registrant system the previous evening, and she had added a procedural recommendation section that identified 3 specific allocation formula adjustments that would close the monitor flag gap for all affected registrants, not just her own case. She handed it to me at the intake desk and said, "Tell me what's wrong with it." I read it. Then I read it again. I told her what was wrong with it. One of the 3 formula adjustments she had proposed required a tier-level review that sat above the Threscale Sector Division's authority, so it would need to be routed through a higher administrative body, which I explained. She nodded, made a note, and said she would revise. I walked them through the housing assignment process. It took about 90 minutes, partly because Sale had questions at each stage, and partly because some of those questions revealed additional gaps I had not thought about, which I noted for future reference. Keith sat next to her sister, and occasionally caught my eye across the intake desk, with the expression I was learning to read as her version of quiet acknowledgement. Not quite amusement, not quite warmth, something that lived in the space between those two things and was, in its own way, more specific than either. By 11 o'clock, they had a resettlement housing assignment in Sector 4 of the outer margin block, adjacent to the way station. It was a small unit, 2 rooms, standard outer margin specification, but it was solid and it was theirs, and the provision allocation was now correct, and the submission was drafted. At 11:15, Keith came back to the intake desk alone. Sale had gone to the health station for her follow-up with Jorath, which she had not forgotten to schedule. Keith said, "I want to thank you." I said, "You don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I'm going to." She was not in the maintained composure now. She was simply standing in front of my intake desk, in the amber-tinted light of the corridor, and looking at me with the copper-gold eyes that were steady in the way that is chosen rather than given, and there was something in her face that was different from any version of it I had seen in the previous 2 days. Quieter, less like someone holding a position, and more like someone who had set the position down. She said, "At the last 2 way stations, I learned that everything has a price, and I had one thing to offer." I said, "Not here." She held my gaze. "No," she said, "not here." I said, "Come back next week for the follow-up. Sales allocation will need a 30-day check-in to confirm the tier adjustment held. And if you want to file the submission formally, I can walk you through the routing process. The higher authority tier for that 3rd adjustment is more straightforward than it sounds." She said, "Will you be here next week?" "Thursday," I said, "and Tuesdays, that's my intake rotation." She nodded. She looked at the door at the end of the corridor and then back at me. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," I said. She left. I watched her go, and then I looked back at my screen and the morning's intake queue, which had 4 registrants in it and was moving at the usual Thursday pace. Pell appeared at my elbow with a cup of tea, which he set on the corner of my desk without comment. "The reclassification for the Arath sisters cleared at 0640, he said, which I already knew. "It did," I said. "Faster than 48 hours. Jorath's notation was clean." "He flagged it priority," Pell said, "without being asked." "He did." Pell picked up his own tea. "The submission the younger one drafted is better than your prior 2 observations." "By a significant margin," I said. "I've already sent it to the sector review address," he said, "with your supervisor endorsement attached since you hadn't gotten there yet." I looked at him. He looked back at me, perfectly even. "The monitoring gap has been in the system for 3 years, he said. "It seemed worth moving on." I said, "Thank you, Pell." "Thursday intake," he said, and went back to Station 2. I drank my tea. The queue moved. The provision staging bay was full. The allocation system ran, and the reclassification held, and at Threscale 12, on a Thursday in the amber-tinted light of the outer margin corridor, the day did what days at a way station do. It processed what came through the door, and it got it right, and that was enough, and I was glad to be there when it was. The seed case was still on the side table when I checked the staging bay at end of day. Sales notation on the back of the emergency pending documentation was still there too. I did not throw either of them away. Some things belong where you find them, and some things are worth keeping until the person who left them comes back to collect. Thursday would come around soon enough. I thought about Keith Arath on the walk home that first evening. The walk is 20 minutes, and I usually fill it with the residual thinking that the day generates, the reclassification backlog, whether merit is developing the right instincts for the forms that require judgment, the storage inventory discrepancies that accumulate if no one pays close attention. Useful things. But I thought about Keithai in a specific way, which was the way you think about something that doesn't fit cleanly into the existing categories you have for things. The offer she had made was not new to me in kind. 19 years on outer margin way stations, and I had seen, in various forms, the calculations that desperate people make. The calculation is simple. I have this, you have that, what will you take? It is a terrible calculation, and it is also, in the circumstances that produce it, a rational one. People who arrive with a caloric deficient 16-year-old and 7 months of unassisted management behind them have generally learned that systems have prices, and that warmth is a transaction like everything else. What I thought about, on the walk home, was the specific quality of the moment after I had said no. She had prepared for every version of the conversation, except the one where the answer was simply no, and the form was simply filed. And when that was the version she got, she had stood there with the copper-gold eyes and the maintained composure, and something in the maintenance had slipped, just briefly, just the once. And what had shown through the slip was not relief, not yet, but something that might become relief if she had enough time to process it. I thought about that for part of the walk home, and by the time I reached my quarters I had mostly set it aside, but not entirely. The next morning I checked the reclassification queue before the intake desk opened, confirmed that the system had received Jorath's notation and had updated sales flag status, and then I pulled up Keithai's registration file. Her allocation was transitier, as I had expected. What I had not examined closely the previous day was the history on her file, the transit processing logs from Velkareth, the waystation records from the 2 stops between there and Threscale 12. Transit tier, both of them, both stops. I looked at the provision records attached to those stops. Sales monitor flag was noted at each one, as it had been at Velkareth. No action taken at either. The record was a quiet documentation of a gap that had existed for 7 months and had been observed and not addressed twice, and Keithai had walked into those 2 waystations and had found the price she needed to pay and had paid it or offered to pay it, and then she had walked out and kept moving. I sat with that for a moment. Then I opened a separate form, a supervisor welfare review flag, which I had the authority to file for any registrant whose record showed a documented pattern of inadequate allocation adjustment despite existing flags. I filled it out for Keithai Arath's file, linking it to the reclassification case already in process for her sister, and I flagged it for the Sector Welfare Review Officer. The welfare review would not change anything immediately. These things rarely do. But it created a formal record that Keithai's own situation had been noted by a supervisor with direct case knowledge, which weighted any future review of her file differently. It took 11 minutes. I filed it and went to open the intake desk. That evening, after the afternoon queue cleared, I found myself back at the side table with a second cup of tea. The Velthorn seed case was still where I had left it. The outer margin light through the east loading door's upper window ran warm in the late afternoon, almost gold at the right angle across the staging bay floor. Threscale 12 was the waystation I had stayed at longest, and the side table by the east loading door was where I had made, without especially intending to, the habit of thinking things through. The tea, the afternoon light, the occasional company of Pell or Kale, the quiet. I thought about what Sale would make of the Sector Provision Standards review system, once she had a working model of it in her head. I thought that she would probably identify things in it that I had been looking at for 3 years without seeing, because she had the specific gift of seeing structure from the inside rather than from the outside, and sometimes that angle reveals things that the outside angle misses entirely. I thought that the submission she had drafted would move through the sector review with Pell's endorsement behind it, and that it would probably produce some adjustment to the monitor flag allocation formula, and that this adjustment would affect an unknown number of registrants who would never know that a 16-year-old in transit tier registration had done the work for them. I thought briefly about Keithai standing at my intake desk saying "not here," in a way that was both a statement about the way station and about me. I finished my tea, set the Velthorn seed case on the small shelf above the staging counter where it would be visible on Friday, and left for the evening. Friday morning came in cold and bright, the outer margins version of a good weather day, the temperature regulation running clean, less ventilation noise, a minor but genuine improvement in the quality of the morning. They came at 9, as I had said. Sale had slept. I could see it in the quality of her attention, still precise, still cataloging, but with a kind of depth behind it that had not been there on Thursday. The copper-gold eyes moved across the intake corridor, and the desk and me with the same careful assessment. But it was the assessment of a person who was rested rather than the assessment of a person who was running on whatever reserve was left after 7 months of moving and worrying and not sleeping enough. Keithai looked the same and different, the same in that the composure was present, different in that it was less maintained, less like a structure she was holding up and more like a posture she had simply arrived in, easier in the shoulders, the hands at her sides not quite so precisely still. I pointed out the Velthorn seed case on the shelf when we passed through the staging bay to the side table where I had laid out the housing assignment documentation. Sale said, "Oh, I thought I'd lost that." She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was small enough to sit in her palm. "It's from the house garden at Velkarath, the central courtyard." A pause. "It's just a seed case, but Keithai said I could bring one thing." Keithai beside her said, "You brought 4 things. The seed case is small enough that it counts as part of the container, not as one of the 4. "That is not what I said, and you know it." Sale put the seed case in her pocket with the precise satisfaction of a person who has won an old argument without having to re-argue it. She sat down at the table and pulled the housing documentation toward her. I sat across from them. The overhead panel ran its slightly cool light. The tea I had made was on the table already, 3 cups, because I had thought about it this time. Sale picked up the first page of the housing documentation and said, "What's the appeal timeline if the Sector 4 assignment comes with a condition flag?" 7 days for a condition flag review, 15 for a formal appeal if the review doesn't clear it, I said. She nodded, and a condition flag would be based on what criteria? Prior registration history, allocation tier mismatch, or a welfare review flag on either file. She looked up. "There's a welfare review flag on one of our files." I had not mentioned this to her. She had found it by reading the housing documentation and cross-referencing the flag criteria against what she knew about their registration history. In about 40 seconds. "Keithai's file," I said. "I filed it yesterday morning." Keithai looked at me. "The welfare review flag is a protective measure," I said. "It creates a formal record that your allocation situation has been noted at supervisor level. For the housing assignment, it shouldn't trigger a condition flag. It's a different subcategory of the review process. But if it does, the review timeline is 7 days and the flag itself is documentation in your favor, not against it." Keithai said, "You filed that for me." It was the correct thing to do given your file's history. She was quiet, the same expression as before, the one between amusement and assessment that I had come to understand as the most honest version of her face. She said, "You do this for everyone." It was what she had said at the side table on Thursday when we were drinking the first tea. I thought about it again, the same way I had thought about it then. "I try," I said. "Sometimes I miss things. That's what the procedures are for, to catch the things I miss." A pause. "Your sister catches things I miss, apparently." Sale, without looking up from the housing documentation, said, "Third page, Section 2, Subclause 14. There's a cross-reference to the provision allocation formula that I think is incorrectly cited. The formula number in the subclause is from the previous version of the standards review document." I looked at page 3, Section 2, Subclause 14. She was right. I said, "I'll note it for the sector review." "I already drafted a correction notification," she said. "It's in the submission packet." Of course it was. We worked through the housing documentation across the next hour. Sale asked questions and Keithai occasionally answered them, and I provided the procedural detail and the system knowledge. The morning moved the way good mornings at a way station move, with a kind of purposeful quiet, things being done and noted and moved forward, the particular satisfaction of process functioning the way process should. At 10:40, the housing assignment confirmed. Sector 4, Residential Block C, Unit 11, 2 rooms, standard outer margin, available for occupancy Friday afternoon. Sale looked at the confirmation on my screen. She looked at it for a moment, and then she said, "It's real." "It's real," I said. She picked up her cup of tea and drank from it, and she looked out the east loading door's upper window at the outer margin's clear, cold Friday light, and she was quiet in a way that was entirely different from the quiet in the intake corridor on Thursday. That quiet had been the quiet of someone conserving themselves. This one was the quiet of someone arriving. Keithai was watching her sister. Her hands around her own cup were relaxed. When she looked away from Sale and back at me, there was something direct and uncomplicated in the copper-gold eyes, not the assessment, not the maintained composure, not the space between amusement and watchfulness. Something quieter than any of those. She said, "Thank you, Oren." It was the first time she had used my name. I said, "You're welcome, Keithai." The outer margin light through the window shifted slightly as the morning moved on, the particular quality of gold that comes through in the middle hours, when the thermal differential is clean, and the light has some texture to it, hitting the concrete composite floor of the staging bay and warming it in a way that it does not usually manage. The Velthorn seed case was in Sale's pocket. The housing confirmation was on the screen. I made a note to check Sector 4 Residential Block C's maintenance status before Friday afternoon, in case there was anything in Unit 11 that needed attention before they moved in. Old habit. Some things are worth knowing before you need them, and some things are worth checking just because checking is what you do. Thursday would come around. It did, it always did, and I would be at Station 1 of the intake desk in the amber-tinted light, and so would they, and the provision staging bay would be full, and the allocation system would run, and whatever needed filing would get filed, and whatever needed fixing would get fixed. That is the job. And standing in the particular Friday morning light of the staging bay at Threscale 12, watching Sale Areth look out a window at a sector she was about to live in, with a Velthorn seed case in her pocket and a housing confirmation on the screen and a teacup in her hand, I was, quietly and without making a production of it, glad. Some things you do not have a precise name for. You just know, when you find them, that they belong to the category of things that were worth doing. This was one of them,